how good it is to see each and every one of you. I have to make friends with this microphone. And I would say I highly recommend the chocolate brownies. I just had one. It will carry me through. Oh my goodness, they are to die for. It's so good to be here tonight with you. It's always great to talk to Valley people. I'm going to tell you a Civil War story, not about a faraway battlefield, but a story of our own valley, the story of Wheeling Hospital, a place I'm sure you've all been familiar with. How many of you have used the facilities at Wheeling Hospital? Oh, good. Oh, great. So you can kind of buy into this. Wheeling Hospital made a contribution to Civil War history, and I'm not sure it's all that well known. It wasn't that long. It was about a year toward the end of the war. You may know Wheeling Hospital is called the Mother Hospital of West Virginia because it's the oldest hospital continuing in West Virginia. And how, you might ask, did it get involved in the Civil War when there were no battles around to generate wounded soldiers? Well, tonight we are going to find out. I would like you to go back with me 151 years to 1864, a bad time in this country, when a civil war was raging, cutting down men for 3 long years. The spring and summer of 1864 was an especially bloody time. The winter encampments had been broken, and with springtime came not daffodils and magnolias, but killing and death. As the war went on, and you know, and I'm sure I'm speaking to people who know a little bit about the war, and they thought it would be over with the first battle, one side would win and they'd all go home, or 2 months, or 3 months, 6 months at the longest. By the third year, hatred and rage were taking hold. April of 1864 would usher in particularly nasty fighting. A key is, in March of '64, Ulysses S. Grant took over the command of the Union Army, and then everything broke loose. He began to press the fight aggressively. Lincoln said, "Get it done, get it over." So he was going for the jugular, Richmond and Atlanta. He would not back down. Unlike his predecessors, there was no retreating for him, but that meant mounting casualties as he faced off with his worthy opponent, Robert E. Lee. The decision was made: wherever Lee went, Grant went. Now, one of the key elements of Grant's strategy was to take back the Shenandoah Valley, take it out of play as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. And it always amazes me when I go down 81, the beauty still. You kind of get nostalgic when you get down the valley, if you can outrun the trailer trucks. Grant sent an army in to deny supplies to the Southern troops. And as you know, they've pretty much driven the Union out for quite a while. He wanted to break the morale of the people, and he did that, but at a terrible cost. Phil Sheridan, his great commander in the valley, said, "I will leave them nothing but their eyes to weep with. I will leave them nothing but their eyes to weep with." And he was true to his word. Now, what happens at Wheeling Hospital that year of '64 is directly connected to the Valley Campaign. On March 4th of 1864, a group from the Soldiers' Aid Society, which was very active, in looking after the needs of the local soldiers. They visited the sisters at Wheeling Hospital to ask them to take care of the military patients at the Athenaeum. Now, the Athenaeum was a Union prison on the corner of 16th and Market Street, across from Independence Hall, where West Virginia Northern is. That was a Union prison, and the stories connected with that are just unbelievable. When the Confederate prisoners would yell out at the windows, curses and everything, and throw things at the Union guards, and the Union guards would just shoot. They would just shoot up at the windows. Well, of course, that had to stop. Part of the prison on the 3rd floor had been turned into a medical ward, with the sick being under the care of one of the great doctors of Wheeling, John Frizzell. And there is John right there. Wheeling has always had a very strong medical tradition because of its early importance as a city, as with Belair. You know, people flocked here over the National Road, later the railroad, and of course, always the river. Now, one of the most outstanding men of national significance to come to Wheeling was Dr. Simon P. Hullion. He ventured here in 1835, it's pretty early. He helped to found Wheeling Hospital, and he died in 1857, right before the war. He was only 46, although in those days that wasn't too young. And he is buried at Mount Wood Cemetery, and if you know what they're doing up there, he's one of the stars at Mount Wood. You know, he's kind of big time. Dr. John Frizzell arrived in Wheeling the next year, 1836. During the Civil War, he was appointed by Governor Pierpont as medical superintendent of the military prisoners and soldiers in Wheeling. So he was the medical power during the war. Then he became an assistant surgeon at Wheeling Hospital. Dr. Frizzell had been attending to the sick at the Athenaeum, but the numbers there were growing. So in early March, 47 sick soldiers were moved to Wheeling Hospital. So it starts. Now, here's a picture of the building, right there. And it was the Michael Sweeney Mansion, which the bishop had bought from Sweeney in North Wheeling, Sweeney Glass, Sweeney Punch Bowl. Before this, from 1853 to 56, the hospital was in a large house at 110 15th Street, which is still standing, which is kind of neat. Go out there and you kind of hear the voices of the past. And the Sisters of St. Joseph are still at this hospital building. They still are there, which is kind of a continuation. Now, it was noted in the Chronicles of 1864, the Chronicles were our basic knowledge of the war here, and it was written by Sister DeChantal Keating. I'll show you her picture in a minute. And it was noted that all the soldiers that came to the hospital were prostrated with disease. Of course, how they talk is different, prostrated. But they really were. 3 died by the end of the month. I mean, these were sick soldiers. The Soldiers' Aid Society paid 50 cents a day for each prisoner. That's interesting. But a greater need was brewing. The Army post in Wheeling, the Union men, saw that they required more formal medical care. Things were getting complicated. So they petitioned General Franz Sigel, commander of Western Virginia. You had to ask the general in charge to set up a post hospital in Wheeling. And by March 17th, he'd issued the order, and his picture is over here on the table. He was a piece of work, though. He has all kinds of stories, which we won't go into. But now the authorities had to find a suitable building. And like today, it took them too long. By April 13th, a month later, they were still looking. And they had considered the Dr. Matthew Houston home on Chaplain Street. He was one of the first doctors at Wheeling Hospital. He had left the city to go south. And excuse me, he joined the rebel army. He was a great doctor who founded the Ohio County Medical Society, which is still operating today. Now, when someone left the city to go south, their property could be confiscated, and his was. And that's why they were looking at his house for a hospital. Eventually, the powers that be decided on the south wing of the Catholic hospital, and this is in the paper, and they said the Catholic hospital. Now, that would seem the obvious place, but then in Wheeling, there was still a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment left over from the Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s. And this was only 1864. They resented the new immigrants, and they especially resented those Irish Catholics. They felt they were polluting the population. So in early April, the mayor, Captain Over, in charge of the Wheeling Army Post, George Wheat, Thomas Hornbrook, came to inspect the hospital, and they did decide to take a part of it over, and they paid rent of $600 a year. Now, Wheeling Hospital had only been in existence for 14 years, and running it were a small, and I do mean small, group of religious women, the Sisters of St. Joseph. So small, in fact, that they ran out of people to run the hospital and the sisterhood. So Bishop Whalen, in charge of the Catholic Church in Wheeling, he had to import, you might say, a woman from Brooklyn, New York, to head up the community and to take over. And that's this lady, and she's, if you've ever thought about having, having a dinner and inviting all the interesting people from history you want to sit down and talk with, she's one I would invite. She must have been tough. And here she is. Maybe I'll just stand her up there for a minute. Or not. Okay. She's the one that wrote the Chronicles when she had time. That's why we don't have a lot of them. The Union soldiers serving some sentences for some infractions were brought in to make changes to the building in North Wheeling. And on April 15th, Captain Over introduced the man who would run the Army Medical Section. This was Dr. John Kirker. Now, he was originally from Pittsburgh. He came back. He died in Pittsburgh. I cannot find a picture of this man. It's driving me crazy. I was up at the Heinz History Center a couple weeks ago, and they were very helpful, but we couldn't find him. He also had been head of the Army Hospital in Grafton, West Virginia, which is a whole other story, and he came from Grafton to Wheeling. He died in 1897 in Pittsburgh, and his obit, we did find the obit, front page of the Pittsburgh paper. So on April 27th, the hospital steward came, a Mr. Cox, very important man, because he oversaw the day-to-day operations, and he must have been very good too. Matthew Altmeyer of the local Altmeyer clan was the ward master. There were 8 private patients beside the soldiers. Dr. Kirker rented a furnished sleeping apartment, $5 a month, and he took his meals with the steward. Now, in May, back to the battlefield, in May of 1864, Grant began the Overland Campaign, and places like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor became well known to Wheeling people. In one 2-day period, Grant lost 17,000 men dead and wounded. 2 days, 17,000. In fact, some of his officers at one of the charges, they said, we can't send the men in anymore. They're just being slaughtered. And he learned from that. It was bloody and it was unrelenting. And as the hospitals closest to the Shenandoah Valley became overwhelmed, then the wounded were moved farther and farther out. Because you think, Wheeling Hospital, so far away. And they moved the wounded mostly by railroad. And of course, the B&O was the main railroad. They protected that at all costs. General Benjamin Kelly from Wheeling, his only job was to protect the B&O. So, where are we here? We're on the B&O. So in July of 1864, a real crisis arose at the hospital. Captain Over came in a panic, and he ordered the entire building occupied. 200 invalid soldiers had shown up. They'd arrived unexpectedly on a train from Cumberland, Maryland. So the wounded were sent up from the station as fast as the Wheeling ambulances could be procured. And some think that they may have also put a few on boats and taken them up the river, to the landing, but I've never found that. I've heard it. Dr. Hazlett feels that's true, but I've never found it in print. The soldiers, there were not enough beds, obviously. There were only 18 rooms in the hospital. So they were laid on the floor in rows of blankets, and eventually more tents were put up outside. Now, they had already put up tents. They had a morgue tent. They had a kitchen tent. It was like a little white colony around the hospital, and they put up lots more. The last months of the 2014, I went to a Civil War conference in Chambersburg to find out more about the 1864 Valley Campaign. And I learned that in July, I kept thinking, why would these 200 show up so fast? In July, they were panicked because Jubal Early, the Confederate general, he was something. He was good. He decided he was going to push in the valley, try to push the Union out. And so he was running around, and he was starting to get close to Frederick and Harper's Ferry at the upper end, or lower end, whatever. And so they started to evacuate. They just started taking them out of the hospitals in that area, and then they had to send them somewhere, and they sent them to Wheeling, some of them. So this would have put an added burden on the whole structure, the whole medical structure. Now, at this time, would you believe, there were 20 orphans at the hospital. And they had to get them out. And so the bishop had a house over on the island, so they hired somebody and got a couple Johnny boats, I guess, and four of the sisters got the kids out. And then they had the private patients, which they weren't that many, and they just told them to leave. I thought, wow, if you were a private patient, where would you go? And there wasn't any place else in the city. So they had to get out too. Now, we've got this small group of 6 sisters were dedicated to the nursing duties. And they began to work almost without stopping. There were only 10 in the whole community. And they were young. They were young women. Mother Deshawnell Keating, who was born in Ireland and brought from New York, she was the oldest. She was 31. Sister Stanislaus, she died in 1917, incidentally. When she left Wheeling in 1879, I think, she took over the orphanage in New York, big orphanage, and she became known as the Mother of Orphans in New York. And when she died, the New York Times printed her obituary. She was pretty famous. Sister Vincent Smythe was 30. She died in 1902. Sister Stanislaus Homan, the Homans from the Wheeling area, she was 23. She died in 1899. Sister Ignatius Farley of Marshall County was 23, and she died in 1931, and she's important. That's her. That's Ignatius. And what's interesting about this and about Mother is sisters didn't have their pictures taken. That was considered immodest. I mean, you didn't go have your picture taken. But this is a really formal picture, and it looks like she's about the age of the Civil War, and I suspect that had something to do with it, because we have few pictures of them, but her we have. Sister Aloysius Sullivan, also 23. Oh, I'm sorry. was 21, and she died 2 years after the war. She was only 23 when she died. I think she got typhoid. And Sister Mary Agnes Kelly, born in Ireland, was 20. And she was one of the nurses. She died in 1883. Can you imagine I try to put myself in their place, what it must have been like to be a young woman in her 20s and faced with the suffering, the types of wounds and sicknesses seldom seen by anybody in Wheeling before. We're talking war here. I don't know if some of you are watching that PBS special, Mercy, or I forget the name of it already. It's every Sunday, I think, at 10, and I started it, and then they had a bunch of legs and arms being taken out in a wheelbarrow, and I thought, I can't deal with that. And it's very real. It's very real. And also shows sisters in the background, which I thought was interesting. I don't know how good it is. I'm going to call over at Frederick, the Medical Museum, and see what they think. But these wounds were bad. The many male nurses, now there were male nurses that attended to the intimate needs of the men. But besides nursing, and the sisters, of course, nursed in the surgery, etc., they comforted the soldiers, they wrote the letters, they read to them, and they prayed with the dying. They were a substitute for the mother, and a lot of the soldiers, as you well know, called for mother, for the sisters that couldn't be with them, and of course for the wives. And this picture, which I dearly love, it's Ann Foreman did this, and it's over on the end, Sister Ignatius. She used the picture of Sister Ignatius, and she is comforting possibly a dying soldier. And the original is hanging, or was hanging, in the lobby of Wheeling Hospital, and since they renovated the place, we don't know where it is. We're figuring they'll bring it back. The bishop said Mass every day at the hospital chapel, and Mother DeShano accompanied Dr. Kirker on his morning rounds to the wards, and she took his orders. And the Chronicle said for a while the wounded just had no beds, and they were uncomfortable, and I suspect they made that known. So the sisters gave up their beds, and they slept on the floor. And you read this not just in Wheeling, but a lot of places where they were overwhelmed at this time. And Sister Ignatius described the scene one night in August of 1864. One autumn night, she said, it was necessary that I remain in the surgical ward long after the scheduled time. And it was therefore very late when I was relieved. Going toward the chapel for a visit, I opened the sacristy door, and closing it, I stood fascinated by the unusual picture of 7 professed sisters worn out from severe hospital duty, who were lying fast asleep on the floor in soldier fashion, each sister unfolded in a blanket, while each weary head was resting on a pillow made of leaves gathered on the grounds. Do what you need to. Over the sleeping group, which included the superior, Mother DeShano, there rested the soft glow from the sanctuary lamp and the delicate fragrance of the incense used during the evening service. And you know, sometimes you can try to imagine that. I just find that very interesting. These women were, and they must have worked really hard, and then they were sleeping on the floor. Now, Sister Ignatius became quite famous because she was one of the last 3 of 617 religious women who nursed in the Civil War. Dying in, as I said, 1931. She was often asked to talk of her experiences. And in one interview she gave just before she died, she remarked, "We had to keep more of the soldiers in the tents in the yard than inside the hospital. We had no trained nurses, for there were none. There were no nursing schools. We had only the benefit of home and practical training. There were a few of us that it was necessary to work almost without stopping." I think they just did what they needed to. The soldiers were from both armies, And of course, no difference was made in the manner of their care. Officers and soldiers in blue or gray, they were all the same to us. And this is generally the case. When you got into a hospital, generally the soldiers became just the sick patients, and they were good with each other because they were all suffering together. Now, by the September of 1864, the 6 nursing sisters were officially enrolled in government service as Army nurses. And that's good to know because that means, they're better documented. And also, they're better paid. In the pension, and they also would receive a pension. In the Pension Act, it was 1892, though most of them were dead by that time. They received $12 a month, which is basically what they received for their nursing. $12 a month was the standard rate, or 12 or 13, I think. This put them, though, in a special professional status, and that was a big deal. And of course, Dr. Kirker would be the one that would have to do that. Now, the Daily Intelligencer on September of 64 reported there were 190 patients. That's pretty good. 19 wounded in battle, and the remainder were afflicted with chronic diseases. Most of the dead in the Civil War were from disease, not battle, and I'm sure you all know that. Rheumatism, fevers, lots of diarrhea, all kinds of diarrhea. This must not have been the best place to be. And the rheumatism, of course, the terrific marching that these men did, especially in the wet and cold, it ruined them for life. You often hear that. Now, in November of 64, the post hospital at Wheeling was converted by order of the Surgeon General to United States Army General Hospital. Again, more prestige. They got more things they needed. It was capable of accommodating 200 patients, housed 140 in November of 64. I went to the National Archives a few years ago, and all the records are there, day by day, name by name, and I copied. You can copy them now on a copier. So I copied all the records. And there's still a little more work to be done, but basically we have the Wheeling Hospital records. One of the worst sights the sisters could have seen at the hospital were several soldiers paroled from Andersonville, Georgia, the infamous Confederate prison camp. And a lot of this comes from the Wheeling paper. Thomas Haskins died at the hospital in January of 1865. The newspaper reported he was a complete skeleton and his legs were frozen up to the knees. Another soldier, a McClure, came about the same time, again, badly frozen legs, but it doesn't say he died. He may have survived, nothing else. I asked one of the speakers, I said, how did these guys get home from Georgia with frozen legs and everything? And bingo, we're talking January, February. They had to come from Georgia to Wheeling, and they probably wanted to come back to die. That's what they did. And he said that they took boats from the prison camp to Annapolis, Maryland, paid for by the government, and then they somehow got trains, connecting trains, and I'm sure these guys would have gotten to the B&O and came, from Maryland to Wheeling to die. I can't imagine. I just can't imagine that. An interesting story about the war years was told by Bertha Ziegler Welty. This is one of the Welty Buick people. She, as a child, she lived right next door on Main Street to the hospital, where the old School of Nursing used to stand. And she remembered a young Dr. Kirker, he was 29 at the time in Wheeling. He asked the children of the neighborhood to shoo the flies off the wounded, as there were no screens in the windows. And she said they would fashion a newspaper onto a stick, and we would brush off the flies. Some of the soldiers they brought in were in terrible condition, she remembers, and everyone in Wheeling flocked to see them, which I thought, oh, geez, let's go look at the sick soldiers. But it was a big deal. I will never forget it as long as I live, she said. I'm sure not. I will never forget it. Makes it real. Now, there was one Civil War Christmas at Wheeling Hospital, December of 1864, and the newspaper had a big article. The entire building was decorated with evergreens, pictures from a soldier artist hung on the walls. A large audience assembled in the chapel to hear a sermon by Reverend Truman, chaplain of the 1st West Virginia Cavalry. All the soldiers able to walk were treated to Christmas dinner by the kind and gentlemanly Dr. Kirker. Visitors were received at all hours, and in the evening there was a grand entertainment with Negro performers, comic songs, and dances. Some artists had been before New York and Philadelphia audiences. Several of the first families of the city attended, and it was a grand success. Interesting who was thrown together there, and they might have had some real art, people who could sing and dance and do whatever. Now, in the archives of the Sisters of St. Joseph in New York, where Mother DeShawna went back, and where she's buried, I would love to get to her grave. I haven't been there yet. There's a pass she had in her scrapbook. It's a pass from February of 1865 to the Athenaeum prison. The sisters from the hospital would still go to the Athenaeum to visit and take little things to the prisoners. It allows the pass, and there's a copy up here, 2 Sisters of St. Joseph to visit the hospital ward where they treated, the reason they kept some people there, they were contagious diseases, so they kept them up there. But it notes that no conversation is to be had with the rebel prisoners. Now, these are 2 women coming in to help them, and they didn't trust them. They didn't trust anybody. Wheeling was a really tough place because it was so divided. You had the Southern sympathizers and the Northern sympathizers. Interestingly enough, this was not unusual. In a letter to a relative, Mother DeShawna describes when she first came to Wheeling in 1864, the Union commander told her he had heard some town talk against the sisters, accusing them of being Confederates. So he demanded they take the oath of allegiance. And Mother DeShawna said sure, and she took the oath for all the sisters. But of course, this wasn't completely off the mark. Mount DeShawna Archives, one of the sisters' letters in their archives is hysterical because, she talks about Lee as if he's, God, and everything should happen, that the South will win, and all of this. Some of these women, especially if they were from Virginia or Maryland, could be very pro-Confederate. It's known that Bishop Whalen was probably pro-Confederate, but he had the good sense to keep his mouth shut. Some of the Catholic priests in West Virginia did not. One time there was one guy, and I forget the details, but they were supposed to pray for President Lincoln, and he absolutely refused. He said, I'm not going to pray. So they took him to jail. They didn't fool around. And in fact, there was a story that the bishop was in a social setting, and he made some remarks that he didn't think would go anywhere. And it got back to the provost marshal, and they issued a order for his arrest, and they had to get to Stanton to cancel it because they found out, somebody must have found out they were coming after the bishop, and that was not a good idea. So, now a big problem, how are we doing here? A big problem cropped up in February of 1865. This is getting, of course, toward the end of the war. The government wasn't paying the bills at Wheeling Hospital. So Mother DeShawna, she was not one to sit back, and they probably needed the money. She took action, and she writes about it. February 6th, now we're talking like today. She decides to go to D.C. So she says, having much trouble regarding the rent of the hospital and despairing of justice without a personal application, I left Wheeling today for Washington City. accompanied by an orphan child, an insane soldier, and a guard, and received government transportation. Now you have to know, and I'm sure some of you may know, that religious women, even to modern times, they never went out by themselves. They either went in twos or they would take a student, and in this case, probably an older orphan. But what gets your attention is the insane soldier. Now we're talking a long journey in February weather, in a carriage to DC, but this woman, I'm going to do it. So, and then the questions, okay, where did she stay? Who did she stay with? Well, Washington was one large hospital. There were 16 hospitals and hundreds of sisters. The Charity Sisters, the Holy Cross, bunches of religious women, because the generals and the doctors figured out the religious women obeyed orders, they were quiet, they were diligent, they didn't talk back. Like Dorothea Dix's gals were very independent. And these religious women were good nurses, and so the doctors liked them, so they kept bringing more and more in. So she said, I went to the War Department February the 8th, 2 days later, presented accounts to General Hardy, who charitably undertook the case. Now, I think she wanted immediate attention. February the 9th, she received an answer who said it was impossible to have the matter settled, and if I would entrust him with the papers, he would give me an answer in a week. So then she turned around, she went home. And February the 18th, about a week later, the quartermaster informed me the application had been granted and all arrears were to be paid. And then she ends, and this is the end of the whole chronicle, Laus Deo, which is Latin for praise God. I thought, yeah, you know, you deserved all of that money, that's for darn sure. The war basically ended at Appomattox in April, so it's only 2 months later the war ended. Gradually the Army activity at the hospital wound down, but it took a while. By July, the sisters were advertising in the paper for regular patients to return, and the whole Civil War experience was very important on many levels, and it was an important page in Wheeling medical history, but also even across the country with all the anti-Catholic sentiment, and they did not understand religious at all. I mean, these women, head to toe, black and white, all the funny looking, didn't know what that was going on. And once the soldiers got into the hospitals, received the care, left, went back to their cities, talked about these great ladies, it broke down a lot of barriers against Catholics, and it really did a lot to help the country accept more of the Catholic faith. And also in Wheeling, you couldn't help but know, I mean, you know, because all these soldiers and all this activity, people began to figure out it was good what was going on. So, we look back and we remember with respect today, with the eyes of history, 151 years ago, the good work that was done at Wheeling Hospital and how it played such an important part in our area in the war, the Great War, and how we can be proud of that. So I thank you very much. It's 6:45. Do we want questions, or are you all ready to go home?
No, we want questions.
We want questions. You got any questions? Okay, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Did Catholics play any part in the Underground Railroad?
Not so much necessarily. Basically, that was the Quakers in this area for sure. The Quakers were all over the place. And you got it, I'm telling you, that was serious business, because you could be arrested, fined, big time, put in jail. But no, the Catholics weren't pretty much into that. I have a feeling they were probably as prejudiced as anybody else. Religion didn't always do it. I mean, the Presbyterians split. I think the Baptists split, Southern Baptists, Northern Baptists. Slavery split a lot of churches, and that was one thing that they were worried about in West Virginia, and that's why I think Bishop Whalen deserves a lot of credit. to his credit, he, as I said, he kept his mouth shut. He was a great diplomat. But that was serious business. But no, I don't think they did. Anything else? Because I can say a few more. One of the things I didn't talk about is the wheeling ambulance. Here it is. This is really famous, and it's important. It was designed and built in Wheeling, Virginia at the time, and it was the workhorse of the Civil War. The ambulance, first of all, the medical situation in the Army at the beginning of the war was absolutely awful. And the name you need to remember is Jonathan Letterman. Jonathan, what's neat about Wheeling is, we were the only game in town in 1861. Everything was happening in West Virginia. We were the first battles. And Wheeling was a key because General Rosecrans had his office in Wheeling. And General Rosecrans brought in as his medical director, Jonathan Letterman. Now, Jonathan Letterman went on from Wheeling to revolutionize medical care in the Union Army. And the other guy that Rosecrans brought in was William Hammond. And William Hammond was Surgeon General when he revolutionized the Surgeon General guidelines in the Union Army. They started out in Wheeling. I am convinced they had cigars and brandy in a room in the McClure, the three of them, and said, how can we get ready for this war? And somebody said, we got to do something about the ambulances, because the ambulances they had, if you were sick, you were worse when you got in them. It was just awful. And so, because Rosecrans was an engineer, but I'm thinking, why would he just decide to design an ambulance? Somebody had to tell him, we need an ambulance. And I think it was Letterman and Hammond. Hammond was his inspector general. He went all over West Virginia, started to build hospitals, Parkersburg, whatever. Anyway, and so Rosecrans' design is called the Wheeling or Rosecrans ambulance. And then they turned them out by the hundreds in the Wheeling carriage. I mean, it caused a lot of jobs made in Wheeling, and they were shipped. The big depot in the area was Cincinnati, and so they would be shipped to Cincinnati and then go all over. Okay, this came about 1861, 62. It was very early. The big battle, the worst day of the war, Antietam, the most killing day. That was when Jonathan Letterman put his evacuation and triage into existence, and the ambulance, bunches of them on the battlefield, was the Wheeling ambulance. It was the first time. It was massively used. Clara Barton was there. Everybody was there. And it was the Wheeling ambulance that made a difference there. And they went on through the whole war. They were the key. And it started in Wheeling, West Virginia. Let's see. And one last thing, they gave medals out. It took them a long time. The GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, that gave the medals, and they were very protective of those medals. I finally got myself one. I thought, I want my own medal, because now you can get them on the open market. But, and so finally they decided after a while to give them to the women. And they gave them to the women nurses, but they didn't give them to the religious. And then they said, oh, well, there were a lot of religious nurses. We'll give them to the religious. And so they gave one to Sister Ignatius and Mother DeShawno. But they both disappeared. The one in Wheeling, we think maybe when they died, they gave them to the families. But there is a line that says, Mother DeShawno wore her medal every decoration day. She was very proud. She had it on herself. And so the medals were gone. So I've been doing some research, and we figure they actually gave them the actual GAR medal. They didn't have a new one designed, but they presented them. But we can't find any documentation of when they did it and how they did it. I can't imagine it wasn't, written up in the paper, but we just know they did, and that's about all there is to that. But they did get acknowledged. Is there anything else? Because otherwise I'm going to be quiet and go away. Thank you again. This has been fun.